So part 2, which is how that history, in my view, influenced the mythology of Europe. Again, quick recap. You start off in the farmers start off in southern Mesopotamia, move up to northern Mesopotamia, and then start spreading along the Mediterranean into Europe. I think there's already people here. There's all there. There's all full of hunter-gatherers, small groups, doing the hunter-gatherer thing, and then the farmers from around the eastern Med, they hop across because the latitude is roughly the same along the Mediterranean, and the climate is similar. People who figured out farming in Mesopotamia could hop across more or less straight, east to west. Setting up colonies on the islands, stage 3, and then having the colonies on the islands, then spreading to the colonies on the northern edge or southern edge of the Mediterranean, because that was the kind of the limit of the places that you could grow the crops that they were used to. And it took ages it took a long time for that stage to kind of head north. Generally speaking, it took there was a long time that people settled in that region. I've labelled as 5 before they could had the ability to move kind of directly north. It was much more of an east-west thing at first. Eventually they adapted the crops to be able to move along like the rivers, like the Danube and stuff. They could start and hop along all the way. But there was kind of 2 halves to that previous settlement, where you got the people down in the southwest, like in the southern Portugal, because of the Gulf Stream making this kind of left-hand edge slightly warmer. The general pattern was Mediterranean, but that area of southern Portugal, which is on the Atlantic, because of the Gulf Stream being slightly warmer, that was viable for that kind of Mediterranean agriculture as well. So the two stage 4 bits before this big improvement of the crops that we work in Central Europe, there was the colonies usually down around river at the mouths of various rivers like the Rhone. That was a thing already, and sort of limited in their expansion because of the climate. But also down here along on the southwest Portugal, there was a lot of colonies along the coast, mostly mining and fishing. And I think that's the kind of key point I want to make, is there was this kind of transition phase after all these colonies had moved west along the Mediterranean and along the coast. There's this transition phase similar to to America, where you had the farmers on the east coast and the and miners and prospectors and hunters and trappers all moving out ahead of the civilized settlements. So if you translate what you know about the colonization of America, it's in 2 stages. The first stage, you get some farmers along the coast, and then you get trappers and miners going out ahead, and then gradually the farming bits gradually move out, and the trappers and hunters move out ahead again. So that's the kind of base situation. And so how does it affect mythology? If you think about various chunks of European mythology, you've got like fauns and satyrs, and going on to doing goblins and leprechauns or whatever. I think these are memories of the original hunter-gatherers, because you start off with in your little colony, say a colony on Crete or Sicily or in Marseille, and you got a walled town, a fortified town on the coast, and inland are all hunter-gatherers. They're small groups mostly, and in reality they were like human and a bit hairy, but they get turned into things like fauns and satyrs and goblins in mythology. So that's one of the first points, and the second point, or an extension of that same point, is that there's a theory that I've forgotten the name of, where it's biological, that in cold climates that there's a reason for things to get bigger. Or you might think it's the opposite, that because it's cold and not enough food, there wouldn't be. You want small things really, which need less energy. But in reality, you get mammoth and giant cave bears and all that kind of stuff. And there's a theory that it's related to I can't remember the difference, but it's related to the area of the skin versus the volume. And what it basically says is that if you're in a cold environment, you're better off being big, because it's something to do with the surface area and stuff, and how heat gets transferred, which seems to fit with what actually happened if you think about the Ice Age and such. And so there's another, well, I don't know if it's a theory exactly. I think this is more for my theory, that if you can apply that same thing to humans, and the mythology about giants and trolls and ogres, is the idea that maybe the hunter-gatherers that survived in the far north were actually very chunky, not physically giant in a kind of literal sense, but sort of, if the average farmer type coming up from moving up the rivers was more like average about 5 foot, and the Cro-Magnon whatever, the hunter-gatherers in the far north were more like 6 foot, then you can see how that can get extended into being about giants and ogres and such. So, and I think that's probably what happened. That these people that were kind of like part Neanderthal were bigger. The Cro-Magnons were physically bigger. I think that's where the giant thing comes from. So that's the thing. So goblins and fauns being basically the hunter-gatherers, and giants and ogres being the northern version. So that's my theory about the root of the mythology about fauns and goblins and all that, and giants or trolls, ogres. And the next thing is elves and dwarves. I think this is actually this from a later time, because I say after the farmers spread all over Europe and mostly got rid of the hunter-gatherers, the Indo-Europeans arrived from around the Ukraine region. Basically because people hadn't figured out horses before then, and but they did, and so they basically came in and took it all over. But I think the phases of that, I don't think it's just one giant invasion. I think it was waves popping across, gradually moving west from the Ukraine region. I think part of the early stage of that was actually more mining, because they had what's called, I think it's called raw copper? I've forgotten the name, but there's a version of copper where it's on the surface basically, or you've got deposits of copper that are so wide that some of it breaks out into the surface. Anyway, and so they had copper working in the kind of in the Urals north of Ukraine quite early. So I think some of the earlier advances from that region weren't actually invasions; they were migrations of miners, following copper mines. And similarly, an earlier version of the same thing is from the Eastern Med doing the same thing. Because Cyprus originally, the word copper comes from the word that leads to Cyprus as well, because Cyprus used to have loads of copper. And there's various islands in the Aegean that used to have it, and I think it's one of Corsica or Sardinia, I forget which, and Spain had a ton of it as well. So you've got two lots, in my opinion, you've got two lots of miners at different periods. So first you've got the Eastern Mediterranean lot coming along, hopping from island to island, chasing copper, and then getting as far as southwest Portugal. And then later, you send out colonies in places like Brittany and southwest England and Southern Ireland for copper mining. So not a kind of a civilization / empire, but a a kind of region centred in southwest Portugal, with a lot of mining bases, sort of like a string of mining bases, sort of along the Atlantic coast. So that's one lot, and then later on another lot coming down from Ukraine, further north. Sort of again following copper deposits to the west. And I think that's basically the root of the dwarves and elf mythology, because a lot of the elf stuff is kind of related to the Atlantic coast, Britain and Ireland. I think it's based on the kind of barrows they built. Like grain chamber, I think it's called in Ireland. These big mounds were full of burial sites, where the kind of the people who I assume are copper miners would bury their dead in these big mounds, and you get barrows and such all over. I think that's the root of the elf mythology. And similar in the north with the Indo-Europeans, dwarves are a big part of Norse mythology. These people living underground and making magic swords and such. And I think they were the what I'd call the first wave of Indo-Europeans, who were basically copper miners and metal workers coming west and mining stuff and making magic weapons. But, not magic exactly, but just copper daggers or iron swords. The other thing about iron is, although people couldn't mine iron that early, you got some iron deposits from meteorites. They'd crash into the earth, and you can get meteoritic iron and make swords out of that. So that's, again, I think that's the root of the whole magic sword thing. So, so goblins, satyrs, etc., as the root of from the early hunter-gatherers in the south, goblins and such, goblins, giants, ogres from the hunter-gatherers in the north, elves and dwarves being the root of that being miners, basically copper miners, or not soft metal. It's copper, tin, silver, gold, etc. They couldn't really do iron yet, but they could do soft metals. We have a large base of it in Spain, because Spain was full of that, and the rest was like scattered around in little patches. So that's that bit. That's elves and dwarves. And the fourth thing, if it is fourth, I'm not sure, I lost count. And I've forgotten it again. What was it? Oh yeah, it's centaurs. One of the things that when the horses were native to around the Ukraine region, but they were quite small, and originally they weren't big enough to be ridden, and you just that's why you had chariots instead, and eventually they got bred to be big enough to carry riders. But for the most part, in the early phase, it was either chariots or wagons, or you could ride a horse, but you didn't want to be too big, and didn't want to have too much armour or anything like that. So it's more for kind of light cavalry, scouting type things. And they started around this region, sort of like around Ukraine, but then they gradually spread west, and came into contact with the Greek farmers in the Balkans. And that's why I think the myths about centaurs come from. The half man, half horse. I think these were that was the kind of settled reaction to seeing these guys riding these horses. So that was that, and the last thing is Atlantis. The thing about Atlantis is it was written about by Plato in whenever it was, but he did it. There was there's this expansion into Europe, and then there was what's called the Bronze Age collapse, and then the ages of like classical Greece happened after that. So when Plato was writing about Atlantis, he was talking about a time before the Bronze Age collapse, and he was talking about a place beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is around Gibraltar. So somewhere on in the Atlantic side of things, which is very kind of metal conscious. They're very, they made a lot of metal stuff. They mined a lot of metal, basically. So that's the key of what he's saying, and I think it's actually true-ish. I think there was this region in southern Portugal, which was part of the Eastern Med civilization, but it wasn't. It was on the Atlantic because of the Gulf Stream made it warm enough for them to grow the regular crops. And as I say, I think they had a bunch of colonies along the Atlantic coast connected to mining, going all the way up to Denmark so they could get trade for amber. Amber had been a big deal for a long time for religious type jewellery, and people have been trading for it all the way back to ancient Egypt and before. And some of it would come down through various rivers down to the Black Sea or down to the Mediterranean, and some of it was traded along the Atlantic coast. So these people in southern Portugal had an Eastern Mediterranean type economy, despite not being on the Mediterranean because of the effect of the Gulf Stream. Anyway, they had all these little colonies around Brittany, South West England, Southern Ireland, and all the way up to Denmark for trading for amber. So if you think of this as a kind of trading empire, empire is really the wrong word, but a trading network of lots of little colonies along the coastal regions, bringing all this metal and various other kind of goods like amber to this spot in southern Portugal, and that I think was what Atlantis was, or at least something connected to that, because a lot of the land around here between Brittany and Britain and Ireland was sunk. I mean, there's the Doggerland thing. That's the big one, which was, I don't know, thousands of years ago. But then there's other spots all around the southwest of Britain and around Brittany, which used to be land, which got sunk under the waves. And there's a spot in Britain called the Scilly Islands, which are right on the southwest edge, and they have it's warm enough again because of the Gulf Stream to have palm trees. But really, they're not really islands. They're the top of hills, of land that used to be there, which sunk, under the waves. Because as I mentioned in the previous bit, Earth has been warming up for since the last ice age. And as it's warmed up, it's melted ice caps, and so land that used to be land is now under sea. But anyway, so I think the legend of Atlantis is actually a combination of one. This was part of southern Portugal, which was the kind of the hub of a kind of trade mining / network along the Atlantic coast, and the memories of these large chunks of land being drowned by the sea. That's my view on what the root of what Atlantis was. Anyway, what's the point of all this? One, I find it interesting, but secondly, is the second thought I had was I hadn't played role playing games for 4 years, but it just strikes me as being a really good setting for role. This kind of early colonization of Europe, being a perfect setting for a game like that, where you basically use the fact that most of their travel is by water, either by sea or by river. So you could use it as a kind of fast travel system, and then you just change all the historical, elf miners into actual elf miners. Really, humans who'd come from somewhere a long way away. But you could just make them elves, and the hunter gatherers just make them fauns. It could be quite good. But anyway, that's me starting to ramble again. But that's basically that's how I think a lot of European mythology came about. It's basically this three-way battle originally between the original farmers and between the farmers and the original hunter gatherers, and then the third being the effect when the Indo-Europeans came and conquered it all. So hunter gatherers, then farmers, then Indo-Europeans, and a lot of the European mythology has their roots in that sequence, in that historical sequence. Okay, so that was part 2. There's an addendum to the mythology which I forgot about, and which I don't know, it may not actually be true. I may have just got it from the Asterix comics. But I think, if I remember rightly, there is some basis for it in historical as well. So I'm going to say it anyway. And if it is just Asterix comics, then something that can be discounted. Anyway, so originally I was saying before that the Mediterranean was its own climate zone, and people could grow what they could grow in northern Mesopotamia. They could generally grow around the Mediterranean. But there's also another aspect, which was because of the Gulf Stream making that kind of southern Portugal area sort of warmer than elsewhere. The Mediterranean climate zone was basically applied to that part of southern Portugal as well. And so you got these people originally from the Eastern Med, after hundreds of years of migration, and they're in that southern Portugal growing stuff that they could grow from Eastern Med, and they're experimenting with trying to grow other crops which would help them expand further north. And one of the things that I've read in the past was that one of the things they did was grow oak trees for acorns and make acorn soup, which apparently was a big deal at the time, and until quite recently, or maybe even now, in the Basque Country or Basque Country, however you pronounce it, acorn soup was a thing. So, and the thing about that, the acorn soup, is how it applies to Asterix the Gaul. So, I mean, the Asterix part might not be true, and basically connected to druids. But so apparently was this thing where people in that southern Portugal area, planted plantations of oak trees, and use that to harvest acorns and then turn that into acorn soup. And it strikes me as interesting in that you got this later connection or overlay, who knows, where druids are supposed to have these sacred groves of oak trees, and according to Asterix, for mistletoe and having golden sickles, making magic potions. But regardless of that, the idea that people, that the people who invented these oak plantations for acorns may have had some kind of religious significance, or even that they planted them for acorns and then made up the religious significance later on to kind of stop people from poaching the acorns. But no, it's an interesting thing that if the connection with the druids is really to do with that, is to do with these people who are trying to figure out how to improve, make more food in a region which didn't grow the sort of crops that they were used to growing. Like I say, along the Atlantic coast, because of the heavy rainfall, and the whole oak tree acorn thing was an experiment by the druids, or by the people who eventually became the druids, or people who claimed to have descent from those people. So it's another addendum on the mythology thing, that if there was, if druids were connected with groves of sacred oak trees, they may possibly have been related to the same situation of people from the southern Europe, or originally the Eastern Med, then moving over to southern Europe, trying to experiment with ways of making more food in regions which didn't support their normal crops. So anyway, Asterix, maybe not.